can we expect discussions and debates mainly on economic and financial policies rather than geopolitical ones? Mr. Zhang?
Yeah, I think that actually geopolitical issues will impact, on both economic cooperation and financial cooperation, global governance issues. Meanwhile, on the regional cooperation level, also have this type of effect. Especially today, actually, that globalization and regional economic integration, both of them are promoting. However, those political issues and especially some of headache problems happened, and then I'm afraid that those issues will impact on our trade issues, investment issues.
That's right. You can hardly separate one from all the others. But that seems to be the hope of the organizer, at least according to the press conference given today by the Chinese host side. Mr. Kennedy, what do you make of it, particularly given the political elections going on in your country and its impact possibly on your country's future economic and financial policies?
Well, there's certainly a full plate of economic issues for the G20 to discuss, and I expect that will take up almost all of the time for the G20 meeting itself, unless something emerges before then, although the different parties, when they make their statements, can talk about a whole variety of issues, as they do at the G7. Probably non-economic issues, if they come up with any extent, will occur in the bilateral meetings between President Xi and the other leaders, and I'm sure will do so when President Obama speaks to Xi Jinping privately.
Mr. Begg, of course, many are pointing to the UK, suggesting the Brexit is likely to be the focus of all the challenges that we might be facing for the years to come for the G20 summit leaders. Do you agree? How much politics, how much economic and financial issues?
Well, I think the general answer is that you can never underestimate the possibility of something unexpected occurring, be it a terrorist attack or an upsurge in a refugee crisis. Any of these sorts of things can happen. This time, though, I would expect Brexit to be relatively low on the agenda because it's in a kind of cold storage at the moment. There's been the vote 2 months ago, but the next stage is going to be when Britain formally applies to leave the European Union, and that looks now like being delayed. So all that will weigh on the global economy at the moment is the uncertainty around Brexit, rather than any of the negotiations and the ramifications of these negotiations. That said, I think it's pretty clear that there's a very wide economic agenda that has to be confronted, which is really about managing globalization.
Right. G20, of course, is one of the world's most important platforms, as we discussed earlier, accounts for 90% of the G20 economies of the overall global trade and 80% of overall global economy. However, the G20, as many believe, should not be and is not a rich countries club. Its mission is to coordinate state policies, influence global economic trends, and achieve win-win situation for all countries. That seemed to be also reflected, Mr. Zhang, I have to say, in the overall agenda of the G20 this time. You not only got the B20, which is the business world of the 20 economies, you also got the G20 summit, and on the sideline you have several developing countries that are not on the G20's platform, in fact coming together as observer countries. And you also got the BRICS meetings on the sideline of the G20s as well. So how much will addressing the developing economies issues, emerging economies come up with their core ideas, be able to help us find solutions of today?
If you look back, you may find that in 1999, when G20 had the first meeting and first forum, at that time actually after Asia financial crisis, and the G8 felt that without dialogue with those developing economies, you will find it's very difficult to deal with financial crisis.
But may I remind you, Mr. Zhang, also over the past few years, emerging economies, some of them have not been doing very well. Instead of being the engine, some suggest they're being the problems of some of the developing world. What do you say?
Even if you look at according to PPP calculation, you may find that developing the economic scale from developing economies already close to the developed world, according to OECD calculation. So that means today, if you look at the global economy, both developing economies and developed economies are playing very important role. That's why G20, on behalf of most of economy scale in the world, their dialogue, policy dialogue, and their action together, also their planning, ambitious planning for the future, and some of policy tools can promote global economic recovery. Meanwhile, we hope we can resolve economic restructuring issues in the world.
Mr. Begg, though, we are looking at a very different time compared to when the G20 was born. At that time, the developed economies, once developing ones and emerging ones, to play a bigger role and bigger responsibility of the world economy, because the former seem to suffer a great deal, and their shall I say, remedies to the economy have not worked, it seems, according to the crisis. And yet now, we are seeing trade disputes between the developed world, developing ones, emerging ones. As the former is saying, let's tighten it up. Others are saying, well, shall we just open it as what it was like when you guys were developing your economies? That's where the core issue is. That also means, are we going to have any consensus being reached at the G20 meetings and summit this time? Because we are talking about very different groups with very different agendas. Mr. Begg.
Yes, and I think also you have to consider that even within groups there are major differences.
That's right.
You mentioned earlier on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and maybe South Africa. Now, there you've got three countries, South Africa, Brazil, and Russia, which are in economic difficulty, significant economic difficulty, very much commodity-based economies, whereas China, as you know, is a strong manufacturing economy. Now, their common ground is not as great as we might think, because they have this label, which comes out of Goldman Sachs, in fact, and it's not a very consistent label about describing their characteristics. So what we'll be looking for in this is ways of managing the many imbalances in the world economy. And here I think we in Europe have to recognize that Europeans are now a source of imbalance because of the significant trade surplus that's been emerging over the last 2 or 3 years. There's also the problem that financial instability has not gone away in many parts of the world and may well return. So what we're looking for is pathways through this, and the G20, because it only meets very infrequently, can only give a steer to what happens elsewhere.
Right.
It has to steer the leadership elsewhere and give ways of trying to make progress. But it is not a big executive body, and that's something we maybe misunderstand about it.
Mr. Kennedy, despite it's not necessarily a big platform for policies, people are pinning hope on it because we're at a difficult time. Any kind of platform, we want to make good use of it. And yet the question is, can we, given the complexities both gentlemen earlier have already talked about? Mr. Kennedy.
Sure. Well, I think we will see incremental progress at the G20 on a wide range of issues, from trade to investment to generating growth, financial governance. These have all been discussed over the past several months, and I expect all will be on the agenda in Hangzhou. We'll see incremental progress in each of these things, but as been said by the other guests, the G20 is not an executive body. It doesn't make final decisions by itself. What it does is reach some type of agreement or consensus, which is then implemented in other institutions like the WTO or IMF or the Financial Security Board, or that for the individual members themselves to take on by them and individually. And I think actually that's where much of the progress in terms of generating growth needs to occur. For example, China's slowing growth is really to get it going further, you need supply side reform to achieve a lot more progress, and that would help a lot. So some things can be discussed at the G20, but a lot is going to be decided elsewhere.
Yes, indeed. But just to follow up, Mr. Kennedy, yes, indeed, some of those will be incorporated into whatever, maybe a final communique among all the state leaders and also business leaders. And yet, all the details related to those big statements are really going to matter the most, even as the iron and steel industry could be, which is a sunset industry, by the way, could be such a big deal between, let's just say, China, India, and the developed world. That is only one drop of water in the big sea that could stir up the debates between and among different camps. So, Mr. Kennedy, once again, how much can be done, and how much do you expect from the final communique or final discussions?
Again, the G20's goal isn't to reach final solution on any of these one problems. It's to identify them, to frame them. And I think actually what's interesting is that there's a lot of consensus on what the problems are, what issues need to be tackled, despite the fact that you've got such a diverse group of countries. But they also recognize the G20 isn't the place to negotiate the final agreements on what everyone is going to do. So I expect to see some good momentum from the G20 meeting, but it's not going to be a place, that's not the purpose of the G20. It's not the permanent five of the UN Security Council for economic issues. It has a different role.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Zhang, but from China's perspective, as the host of the G20 this time, it hopes to achieve as much as possible as long as there is consensus among members of the G20 and all the participatory bodies. What do you think, despite the fact that earlier the B20 and the finance minister central bank governors meeting have been doing quite well?
Yeah, actually, I think that both for financial governors, banks governance meetings and trade ministers meetings and financial ministers meetings, you may find that this time actually practically China promoted G20 as fast as they can do. For example, if you look at trade minister meetings in the past, you cannot make sure which year there will be the trade ministers meeting. But this year we can confirm in the future annually we will have trade ministers meetings. This is a very big progress. Meanwhile,
as long as they meet, there could be something happen, right?
Right. Secondly, if you look at the investment field, you may find that this time China play a constructive role. We suggest to have our 9 principles for international investment. So this is a first step. In the future, maybe we can design global investment framework on which you may find that both the developing economies and developing economies can benefit from that. Third one, I think that on monetary policies, especially you mentioned, in order to prevent competitive depreciation, that means we have to dialogue on foreign exchange rate issues. That's also very critical.
And of course, that's this job, the IMF and some of the other organizations, yet the issues at least can be discussed at the G20 summit. Having said that, though, there are some other issues. We've seen competitive ideas and platforms being proposed over the years, even just about trade itself, even just about the grand plan of the future. We talk a lot of TPP, OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiatives for that, and some of the regional mechanism as well. We do not know when the dust will settle. Are we going to see once again those debates being picked up at the G20, whether it's B20 or the G20 summit, or on the sideline of it? Will this platform provide a better understanding for all parties, or only getting those fights ever more fearful? Mr. Kennedy.
I'm sure that those will be discussed. I think that we ought to see that since the Doha round collapsed in 2008, or at least came to a standstill, the development of regional agreements, plurilateral agreements has expanded. Leading countries throughout the world, including China, have promoted these. And I think even though it might be ideal to have everything in terms of trade be adopted by the WTO in Geneva, with that at a standstill, many paths to liberalization, even competitive liberalization, is the road that we're on right now. And hopefully eventually paths will lead back to Geneva, perhaps through an FTAP. But I don't think, the WTO has rules about what regional and plurilateral agreements should look like, and as long as they're consistent, they're accepted. We have over almost 400 of them right now. So I expect that trend is going to continue. And I don't, we can make the best of it. It's not the perfect world, but it's something that we can live with.
All right. And Mr. Begg, I do have another question for you as well, because Europe and Russia has not necessarily been on great terms, and yet Russia, as we can see, has been topping the guest list this time. Even your prime minister has confirmed, according to some media reports, to have a bilateral with the Russian President Vladimir Putin this time during the G20 summit. So what can we expect out of this, even on the sidelines? Some rare opportunities?
Yeah, I think that there's always opportunities for leaders to get together in a quiet room to discuss the things that have been causing so much difficulty. Now, Russia is a very difficult case at the moment because it's economically weak but militarily belligerent at the moment, as we've seen in Ukraine. And what I would expect is that the G20 provides a forum in which leaders can meet in a non-confrontational way to try to make the beginnings of new approaches. And we will see this as well in the economics, because it's an opportunity to set strategic directions, to make political commitments which are then followed through in long-term development, such as in the infrastructure, in the One Belt, One Road approach.
Right.
That's where G20 has its unique role in trying to create momentum for change.